much for this. My speech will be structured around two focal points. The first part of my intervention is entitled United Nations Security Council in Africa. And my second part will deal with Africa at the United Nations Security Council. In my first part, United Nations Security Council in Africa. So the key idea in this part is to explain the reasons in the diversity which justify the presence or precisely the United Nations Security Council actions in Africa. Looking at the practice and the current facts, two main reasons could explain why the United Nations Security Council is so present in the African continent. The first one is legal, and the second is political. Part of these two reasons, we may note that sometimes United Nations Security Council is unfundable where it must be. Going to the legal reason of United Nations Security Council presence in Africa. In general, both legally and politically, the intervention of the United Nations Security Council in Africa, as it could be in other countries of the world, is linked to the statutory mandate contained in the Article 25 of the United Nations Charter, which is to guarantee peace and security by acting on behalf of the international community. Over this general legal reason, the key legal reason for the United Nations Security Council to intervene in Africa is to establish or to reinforce the state of law in Africa. For doing that, the United Nations Security Council cooperates with the regional or sub-regional organizations such as African Union, ECOWAS, EMUA, and other sub-regional organizations by assisting them in the election processes. The United Nations observant mission for election can be justified by such aim. In many contexts of elections, the United Nations Security Council has manifested an interest for transparency in the devolution of the political power. The second legal reason is linked to the United Nations Security Council will to promote good governance policies in African countries where problems of bad governance occurred or existed. To do this, the United Nations Security Council is very interested to fight against corruption and money laundering. In fact, the United Nations Security Council is aware of the fact that many conflicts as far as armed and non-armed conflicts are concerned in Africa are due mainly to post-electoral crisis and poverty due to bad governance policies. By acting for transparency in the devolution process of the political power during elections, and by fighting against bad governance, the United Nations Security Council is assuming implicitly one of its functions, which is the prevention of conflict. When these actions fail, the United Nations Security Council can play a political role in Africa when it comes to the resolution of occurring conflicts. And I'm going to the second part of the first weight part, political region of the United Nations Security Council presence in Africa. Two political or pragmatic reasons sometimes justify the presence of the United Nations Security Council in Africa. The first reasons are political, crisis in the diversity. The second are the peacemaking and peacekeeping operations. It is very well known that one of the continents with many post-electoral crises is Africa. The situations wherein there is no post-electoral crisis or transitional government after election are very rare. When some crises occur, depending on the extent of the crisis, the United Nations Security Council could intervene if he considers that the condition of the Article 39 of the United Nations Charter about qualification of threat to peace or security are met. In many cases, the United Nations Security Council has intervened, such as in Liberia, Ivory Coast, Central Africa, Burundi, Mali. Those interventions sometimes are coupled with peacemaking or peacekeeping operations. The cases of Ivory Coast, Central Africa, and Mali are very illustrative. Where the legitimacy of the United Nations Security Council is sometimes questioned is the time of its intervention. In fact, the political and institutional structure of the African Union is based on the subsidiarity and complementarity principles when it's come to intervene in some conflict area in Africa. Schematically, if the conflict is sub-regional, the competency of the African Union is subsidiary. The African Union is authorized to intervene when the sub-regional organization is unable to deal with the situation. Sometimes the intervention of the both are complementary. This logic of subsidiarity is opposable to the United Nations Security Council and precised by Article 52 of the United Nations Charter when it's come to him to intervene in Africa. But sometimes the latter, I'm speaking about the United Nations Security Council, intervened without having the authorization of the African Union, violating by such way the integrity of the organization and its principles. Moreover, there are some situations where the United Nations Security Council action are weighted, but unfortunately, it doesn't appear. So the unfoundable presence of the United Nations Security Council in Africa. The attitude of the United Nations Security Council vis-a-vis to some current crises in Africa is sometimes problematic. These are the cases of the fight against terrorism in Africa and the persistence of neocolonialism politics in Africa. If at the international level, sometimes bilateral level, I'm thinking about Lepelletier case, the United Nations Security Council is very preoccupied by the terrorism acts. When it's come to consider this act in Africa, the attitude of the United Nations Security Council is troublesome. Today, no resolution, neither recommendation of the United Nations Security Council is taken about the situation in what we call G5 Sahel in Africa. The United Nations Security Council is silent, and its silence is loud. Moreover, if the United Nations Security Council is fighting against bad governance, he refused by the same way to attack to the root of this evil, which is the neocolonialism. Many illegal contracts are signed between African countries and powerful North countries, which affect directly the system of governance of these African countries. Sometimes these illegal contracts operate some changes of the political and economic system in these countries. In this context, the United Nations Security Council should intervene by recalling the main principle of the United Nations, which are equality and sovereignty between states. In 1971, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, in his advisory opinion, has recalled the indifferent principles of the international law and international relationships to the internal affairs of state in the case of the presence of South Africa in Namibia. Nevertheless, this contradiction of the United Nations Security Council let the African countries draw the conclusion that the United Nations view about African problems are not guided by neutrality and impartiality, but by interest, global or private. This observation creates the necessity for Africa to be present at the United Nations Security Council instance. And I'm going directly to my second point. Africa at the United Nations Security Council. In this part, due to the insufficiencies or the lack of legitimacy of the United Nations Security Council action in Africa, it's come to deal with the main reason for the African continent to be part of the United Nations Security Council. Some African countries are still non-permanent members, but the question which raised up is linked to how Africa could be more represented numerically. For that, the African position is double-pointed. The first regions are legal and the second ones are political. Legal reason to take African continent present at the United Nations Security Council seriously. Two reasons will be outlined. The first is guided by the legal and staff doctrine of democratization of the United Nations Security Council. The second is typically African and is connected to the Ezulwini Consensus, which was adopted in Swaziland. The need to democratize the United Nations Security Council is to take into account the diversity and the plurality of opinions of the international community members. Even though the international community is not enough integrated, it cannot be denied that there are some aspects around which a consensus could be found. The treatment of these concerns has to be inclusive by taking into account as much as the diversity of opinions of nations. Moreover, today, with the United Nations Security Council, we are facing to the world's political governance system. This one has to be more inclusive in order to show a kind of transparency in its actions. The consensus in the United Nations system is not only modus of decision, but also and mostly a structural principle of governance. The second region, which is typically African, is the consensus of Ezuluwini. In fact, in 2005, the African Union has manifested its desire for reforming the United Nations Security Council composition. The African proposition is to increase the African seats at the United Nations Security Council with 2 permanent members with veto rights. This idea is due to the fact that African continent has only 3 non-permanent seats, and that is not equitable following the ratio. This legal reason are sustained by political ones. The political reason for Africa to be part of the United Nations Security Council. 2 political reasons justify the presence of Africa at the United Nations Security Council instance. The first reason is explained by the fact that Africa is the main seat of peacekeeping operation around 2/3 of the United Nations peacekeeping operation in the world. For that, it is important and even necessary for Africa to be part of the United Nations Security Council. That will allow him to have an African view on the African problems when they are discussed and to bring African solutions to African problems. The second reason is to give an African color to the international dispute settlement mechanism drawn by the United Nations Security Council. Today, at the International Criminal Court, the African position is that this court
Germain, your voice is cut. You muted it.
please, okay. And that does reflect, okay, I will repeat because I was disturbed by a call. Sorry. I say today, at the International Criminal Court, the African position is that this court is absolutely turned to African continent. This creates a sort of asymmetric justice and does not reflect so much the reality of the criminal politics in the world. By being at the United Nations Security Council with 2 veto rights, the African continent will contribute to balance the politics and also to avoid that some veto rights preclude the punishment of some authors of crimes. Moreover, for the restoration of state after post-electoral crisis, one vision of the African presence at the United Nations Security Council is to contribute significantly with an original vision of transitional justice. And to conclude, we must keep in mind that the African view about the United Nations Security Council is very controversial and critical. The African state impression is that the United Nations Security Council is not so representative and is not acting with neutrality and philanthropy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the words and everything, for your whole presentation, Germain. It was really amazing. Questions can be posted later on. So Andrea has finally joined us. So after the post this, I would like Andrea to speak. And ma'am, you may start.
Thank you very much, Siddhartha. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for being late. I thought it was at 12:30. My mistake. Well, thank you very much for the gentle invitation. Firstly, I would like to thank Siddhartha for convening this conference. And of course, I'm very glad to share the floor today on this panel with 2 colleagues, Germain from Burkina Faso and Alecia from Australia. As you know, the 3 of us, we were part of the winter courses at the Hague Academy of International Law in the Netherlands these years on January. And it was an amazing experience. So if you are an international law lover, I would highly recommend to follow one of these courses, and even you can apply for a scholarship. So if you have any question, maybe at the end, we can answer that. So as Siddhartha said at the beginning, I imagine, because I was not there, I work as a diplomat, as a Venezuelan diplomat to the United Nations office in Geneva since 2015 to 2019. And it was a great experience for legal and political analysis. And as you know, the UN headquarters in Geneva is covering different topics that the UN headquarters in other parts like New York, Vienna, or Nairobi. For example, the United Nations office in Geneva is more related to human rights, humanitarian affairs, labor, trade, climate change, and disarmament. But I will explain that later. So I will divide my presentation in two parts. The first part is to talk a little bit about the United Nations purpose and principles, and of course, particularly the Security Council and the official position of the Venezuelan government regarding the Security Council and the UN system. And my second part will be to share with you my experience as former diplomat to the United Nations office in Geneva. Well, to start talking about United Nations, I would like to read a short paragraph from the yearbook of the United Nations from 1946 to 1947, and it's a From War to Peace. So the hope of generations came to fruition in 1945 in the creation of the Charter of the United Nations, the foundational treaty of an international organization formed to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, and to promote social progress and better living standards, and of course, human rights. If you have a hard copy of the UN Charter, you can follow my intervention, so maybe will be easier. And of course, so this charter was discussed during the San Francisco Conference in United States, starting on 25 April 1945, and was open for signatures by states on 26 June 1945. And the United Nations was born and guided by this small and at the same time big instrument. So from my perspective, if you want to understand what the United Nations is, you have to start by the most important, that is the purpose and principles. From my opinion, this is the heart of the United Nations. So let me read a little bit the chapter number 1, just some purpose in article number 1. So the first one is to maintain international peace and security. Of course, this is the task of the Security Council from any act of aggression or threat to the peace. Second, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and of course, self-determination of people. Third, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems. And number 4, UN has to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common goals. Let us talk a little bit about article number 2 is the principles of the United Nations. So we have principle number 1 is the organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. For me, from my perspective, this is one of the most important principles in international law and of course at the UN Charter, because what does it mean? The principle of the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. It means that there's not a state above the states. I mean, there's no more powerful state to another. All the states are in the same level. So it doesn't matter which are the political, economic, cultural, social capacity of a specific state, because in international law and international relations at the UN, all the states are in the same level. So equal rights, equal obligations, and equal responsibilities. That's the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. And it's also important to say, because some people think that international organizations such as UN is above the state. And it doesn't exist, because normally international organizations are created by states, are composed by states, and thanks to the financial contribution of states, international organizations exist. So without these conditions, international organizations would not exist. So we cannot say that there exists an international organization above the state. They are both subjects of international law, states and international organization, and there's nothing above the state. That's the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. Okay, so now to talk a little bit about the organs of the United Nations. As you know, we can talk about 5 main organs. So we have the General Assembly, the Security Council, we have the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, we have the International Court of Justice, and we have the Secretariat. And also some people, well, it's in the UN Charter, the Trusteeship Council, but it's not working anymore because the Trusteeship Council suspended its operations on November 1994, 1 month after the independence of Palau. That was the last remaining UN trust territory. But the Trusteeship Council is not working anymore. So we can talk about 5 main organs in United Nations, and particularly we are going to talk about the UN Security Council, that is the topic today. So basically, this is in chapter 5 of the UN Charter. I don't want to repeat some information that you already know as the composition, powers, and function of the Security Council, but just maybe a gentle reminder about the composition. So we have 50 members, the 5 permanent: China, Russia, France, United Kingdom, and United States. And we have the non-permanent members that they are elected for 2 years term. And currently the non-permanent members are Vietnam, Belgium, Dominican Republic, Indonesia, Estonia, Niger, Germany, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, South Africa, and Tunisia. And the current president of the Security Council for May 2020 is the ambassador of Estonia, because as you know, the presidency of the Security Council is elected on a rotation basis every month. So every member of the Security Council could be a permanent or non-permanent member, could be every month the president of the Security Council. It's in alphabetic order in English. So talking about Venezuela, we can say that Venezuela has been elected as member of the Security Council in 5 different times. The last one was from 2015 to 2016, and it was an important role. And in the case of India, for example, I was checking, and India was also elected and has been member of the UN Security Council in 7 times, and the last one was in 2011 to 2012. So talking a little bit about the official position of the Venezuelan delegation regarding the UN system and the Security Council, we can say that Venezuela is proposing a reform to restructure the UN system because there are many injustices and inequalities in the UN system. For example, I will give you 2 examples just for the analysis. And the first one is regarding the General Assembly, and the second one, the Security Council. So for example, firstly, the decisions of the UN General Assembly are just recommendations. So they are not a legally binding instrument. And if we take just 2 examples of historical resolutions, we can talk about the resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly regarding the embargo imposed to Cuba by the United States. And even when the majority of the states are supporting to unblock Cuba, United States is not respecting these decisions. Second example, for example, we have the resolution adopted to reject US decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Even when the majority of the states recognize and reject the US decision to declare Jerusalem as the Israel capital, the United States didn't respect the decision. So we can see that even when we have a strong document, for example, the decisions of the General Assembly that are recognized for the international community as very important, and for international law, they are not respected. So international law is broken. And we need to give more power to the General Assembly because recommendations are not enough. We need a legally binding instrument to enforce member states to respect international law and the principles and purpose of the UN Charter. This is one point, and that's the Venezuelan delegation position. And the second one is regarding the UN Security Council, because Venezuela has proposed to suspend the veto power. Because if we want to have a more democratic organ, we need to have equal rights between its members. As Germain said, there are an asymmetric justice inside of the Security Council. So, for example, this is incompatible with the principle of sovereign and equal states. They are not equal inside of the Security Council because they don't have equal rights. The permanent members, they have this veto power, and it's a very complicated procedure now. It was justified maybe after the Second World War, but it's not justified anymore to have this veto power. It's a non-democratic tool. So that was one of the proposals of Venezuelan delegation, to suspend the veto power if we want to have a more democratic organ as the Security Council, and if we want to respect the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. And just to finish, because I know we don't have too much time, my second part is to share with you a little bit my experience as former diplomat to the United Nations office in Geneva. So just to explain a little bit, inside of an embassy, a permanent mission, we have the high-level authority, that is the ambassador. He is called the permanent representative. And then under, we have a deputy permanent representative, that when the ambassador is not available, or he has another commitment, or he's sick, he can delegate responsibilities to the DPR, the deputy permanent representative. Then we have under the minister consular, we have a consular, a third secretary, a second secretary, and then we have a third secretary. I was in the position of second secretary in the political section, and it was a great experience. So I had the opportunity to accompany the ambassador to several meetings. As I said before, in the UN headquarters in Geneva, we have the Human Rights Council, we have the humanitarian organs, for example, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, we have the International Organization for Migration, we have the International Red Cross, we have other organizations, for example, the World Trade Organization, WTO, we have the World Health Organization, WHO, we have ILO, International Labour Organization, IPU, International Parliamentary Union, and others. And I had the opportunity to accompany the ambassador in several meetings, but I'm gonna talk particularly about my experience at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So I would like to explain a little bit our task. So we have to attend meetings, taking notes, we have to write statements and inputs, we have to participate in negotiations or informal consultations to draft resolutions, we have to write formal reports to send to the capital in Caracas, and then we have to wait for instructions because we cannot act as we want. We have to wait for formal instructions from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and well, we'll have to participate in lobby, receptions, and any other diplomatic activities. So basically, talking about the Human Rights Council in Geneva, I will explain very quickly a little bit. So the Human Rights Council was created by the General Assembly on March 15, 2006, by the resolution 60/251. And the idea was to replace the former Commission on Human Rights that was a subsidiary organ of the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. And the Human Rights Council has 3 ordinary sessions during the year. So we have in March, June, and September. And also we can have extraordinary sessions, special sessions, if there is an emergency around the world regarding a violation of human rights. And the Human Rights Council is composed by 47 members. Not all the member states of the United Nations are part of the Human Rights Council, only 47, and they have to fulfill some conditions like high-level standards in human rights. They have to be elected by the General Assembly every year, and of course, based on an equitable geographical distribution. So they are elected the members for a 3-year terms with the right to be re-elected for a second period. Actually, Venezuela is a member of the Human Rights Council. It was elected last year, and it's going to be for a period from 2020 to 2022. And well, as I think my time is over, I just try to give you some political and legal elements for your analysis. Thank you very much again for the gentle invitation, and I hope everyone is safe at home during this pandemic situation, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alecia, for all your insightful words. Any questions again, we will be taking after Alecia's presentation. Alecia, you may go forward. I am unmuting you. So yeah.
Oh, thanks. Thank you to my colleagues for making sure that my presentation is going to look absolutely shocking next to theirs. But so as Sid has previously mentioned, I am a consultant for the US government and I work in military law and regulations. So my major role is actually in the Uniform Code of International Military Law. So for me, this is a bit of a different field. So what I did was I've just put together a quick PowerPoint presentation. It's absolutely so basic, but I think sometimes you need to go back to the basics so that you can go forward. So this one. So I think I've done this right. But anyway, while that loads onto there, I'll just start flicking through it.
Are you able to get it?
Okay, so huh? You didn't get it?
No.
It's just loading.
Okay,
I'll start.
I think your screen also just...
Yeah. So what I'll do is... Oh, it's just because this is loading, I think. Australian internet is just not very good. So I'll quickly start this. Like everyone else, my presentation will be in two parts. The first is just such a brief overview on what exactly the United Nations Security Council is, what it does, what it's made up of, and how Australia has a role in that. And then I'll move on to, I guess, a bit more about my job and my life, because I think it's pretty cool. I think my life's pretty interesting. So what is the Security Council? Pretty basically, the Security Council is one of the principal organs of the UN, and its main responsibility is to maintain peace and security under the UN Charter. And it's made up of 15 countries, the 5 permanent members, and then the 10 elected ones who can sit for a 2-year term, and their 2-year terms can't back onto each other. So there needs to be some kind of break between them. So the countries which are part of the Security Council and are permanent, like my colleague said just before, is China, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States. And then the 10 current non-permanent members are on the list in the presentation. And what you'll notice is that it's not a change of 10 countries. It doesn't just automatically happen. They're elected in lots of 5 for each one of the 2 years, and then they turn over almost individually, so that one member is stepping out and a new member steps in and 9 of the rest remain. So the overall role is to ensure that there's international peace and security, and this function is continuous because it is a body which remains for the entire year. Any security or peace concerns which come up in any country that is a representative can come through and bring those queries forward to the United Nations headquarters. So, as was previously touched on, there is a presidency of the Security Council every month for the entire year. and a new country is elected from the 15 countries. So what are we in now? May. So at the moment it is Estonia, and it'll turn over to France next month. And the reason this is done is just to ensure that there is a very neutral basis and that no country is seen to have more of an authority or less of an authority than another. And then each country gets a turn at holding that presidency. So a bit about Australia, not that Australia really, I think, has a major focus within the United Security Council, but we have on 5 occasions between 1946 and 1947, 1956, 1973, 1985 and 2003 played an important role in drafting articles of the UN Charter, which has specifically dealt with the Security Council. I'm pretty lucky that in the 2013-2014 election, it was my father who was actually part of the Security Council and a member from Australia. So we had a lot of documents around the house at that point in time and got to have a real insight into how all of these things are drawn up and what goes on in terms of the life of people who are dealing with all of these issues. So Australia's first presidency for the Security Council was in 1946, and it provided the first military personnel as a peacekeeper under the UN Auspices the year later to Indonesia. So from 1985 to 86, Australia pressed for reform and working methods of the Security Council to better reflect the modern world and ensure accessibility to small and middle-sized countries. And this is specifically important for a country like Australia because Australia is a middle-sized country, and we're quite remote down here in terms of the fact we don't have a large country anywhere close by. I mean, if I want to jump on a plane and go to, say, China or the US, it's a couple of hours and a lot of overlays. So when I went to The Hague, for example, it was 3 days of travel and 6 connecting flights. So ensuring that these smaller countries get somewhere to stand is pretty important. Since then, Australia's further developed its expertise in diplomacy, peacekeeping, peacebuilding, and continues to advocate for the greater transparency of accessibility to its deliberation. So during our term from 2013 to 2014, Australia played an important role in dividing response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa and the response to the shooting down of the MH17 over Ukraine. So Australia has been active in its peacekeeping duties, and a lot of the time they're a lot closer to home, especially since we've got a lot of smaller islands surrounding Australia. So it's important that we, as such a large nation within the Pacific, do a lot for our neighbours. And obviously then we've got a responsibility to help other countries in terms of our refugee and peacekeeping efforts. So Australia's Parliament has always kept a keen interest in UN matters, although unlike other countries, we don't really have an international understanding within most of society. Australia keeps itself, I believe, pretty close to home. So, I mean, when I was studying my law degree, international studies wasn't even a thing. I didn't do a single subject of international law. I did family law. And I think I also did like commerce or something silly. So it doesn't, I think the biggest thing to take out of this is that you can always pick these things up wherever you go. And that was what was so amazing about The Hague. Was one of the reasons I went was because I don't have a massive background in international law. My law degree is very much simple and simplistic, and obviously all of these little things you do, and even these talks, like I learned things along the way, so they're pretty cool. So Australia has kept its role with the UN, and particularly at the moment is working for our next role, which will be in 2029 apparently, when we'll have another seat at the table. So that's pretty much all I have on the subject. As I said, it's not my forte, but I'll move on to my life. So like I said, post university, I actually went and did family law. which is very different to what I work in now with the military. And family law was okay. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but it's there as a backup if anything goes wrong. So my job means that I live in the US for 11 months of the year and get to come home every now and then. However, I missed my flight to the US due to coronavirus, so I've been working from here, which is a little bit hard. So my job entails ensuring that any conflict that goes on in a country that's outside of the US, the United States troops are protected within both the US law and the law of those specific countries. So for example, at the moment I'm dealing with, one of the cases is about some rogue troops that got up to some mischief in Afghanistan, and there were a couple of fatalities. So my role is to, when these things happen, is to ensure that I get the troops back to the US ASAP without them having to face prosecution within the country where those crimes actually occur. Because obviously the difference between how we're going to prosecute them in the US and what they might face in Afghanistan is very absolutely different. I think if I left a lot of them in Afghanistan, they'd probably be dead. So it's very interesting to see how those kind of things work, and working with the different governments to ensure that we can get them back and we get them back and they face prosecution within our laws. But obviously then there is a lot to do with how international law works with that. So how can you just pick someone up who's committed a crime in one country and bring them back to another country? So within military law, there is some uniform code in terms of personnel, just like sea law, in terms of people being able to face prosecution within their home country because they're on home soil, pretty much is what my job says. Read into it what you want. Some of it isn't true, some of it is, but for most of the time when you're serving overseas, you almost have diplomatic immunity as a soldier, even though I wouldn't ever write that in an essay or anything, but that's what we work off, the fact that these people are there to help and serve a purpose, and we bring them back home to prosecute them ourselves and do all the rest. So in that, even though I'm working in the US, I get to go to Afghanistan, Iraq, probably once every 3 months, and have face-to-face contact with the people there. So it's a pretty interesting job. I'm going to wrap up there because that's as interesting as my life gets. So thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Alecia, for having us. I think a few questions that's there. The one basic question that all participants want to ask is regarding the coronavirus and the UNSC. So out of the three, who would like to go first? Also, I would also like to state that Marie, who is currently a teaching assistant at Glasgow University, has joined us. She's a former alumni of the Xiamen Academy in the batch of 2018. And Faadhil Adams, another alumni of the 2020 Hague Academy, has also joined us for this so-called webinar. So, Andrea, Germain, who would like to take up this question?
Coronavirus?
Yeah, coronavirus and the UNSC.
Okay, I will take first the floor, and then after Andrea could complete. So what I can say is, and what is very, very, very interesting to say in my point of view, is the fact that the attitude of the United Nations Security Council vis-a-vis to the coronavirus crisis is also troublesome. Why? Because we are noting and facing also to a sort of silence of the United Nations Security Council. You know, before, when it's come to deal with the Ebola virus crisis, the United Nations Security Council has adopted a resolution which contains some guidelines to fight against Ebola virus crisis. And now, facing to coronavirus, nothing is done by the United Nations Security Council. So I'm questioning myself, what justify and what can justify this silence of the United Nations Security Council vis-a-vis to coronavirus? So for me, it is it's not understandable, because the degree of the threat of the coronavirus is very high comparing to the degree of Ebola virus. And but in this situation, United Nations Security Council refused to adopt a resolution or some recommendation for the state and for the health organization. I don't know why. So I'm questioning myself, and perhaps by discussing, we'll find together answer to these questions. But I'm very astonished by the silence of the United Nations Security Council vis-a-vis to the coronavirus crisis. This is some lines of the answer which can be completed by the other commentators. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, obviously, Andrea, if you'd like to comment.
Thank you for your answer. Recently, we were talking about like the role of the UN system and the World Health Organization to control this pandemic situation. And we can see that the WHO is doing an amazing role to control the pandemic. Nevertheless, recently, the United States decide to withdraw the financial contribution to this international organization. So this is going to become more critical without the contribution of one state in this situation. We also see, for example, states like United States that accuse China for the spread of the virus. But I would like to ask you, is the moment to accuse a state, to put the blame to one state? Because if this is the case, as the China Minister of Foreign Affairs said, they can also accuse the United States, for example, for the spread of the flu H1N1 in 2009, or for discovering the AIDS in the 1980s. So I think it's not the time to put the blame to one state, because we have, as international community, to work together in this time. I think every state has to contribute with the actions of the United Nations to control the pandemic and to avoid the spread of the virus. And of course, we need the contribution of the states to the World Health Organization, but it's basically this. I think the most important role right now in the UN system is the WHO, the World Health Organization. And all the states has to assist and to provide technical support and to provide financial support to this organization to find vaccinations and to find like a solution as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Alecia?
Just said is really important is that, number one, the first thing that really differs between Ebola and COVID-19 is the geological impact that it's had. So Ebola, which is quite almost stuck in one kind of area, versus something that's literally shut down the entire world. I mean, I don't think there will be another point in our lifetimes, or probably in our children's lifetimes, where an entire world just stops. That planes stop, travel stops. You can't even move from state to state. Like you can't go anywhere. People are stuck in houses. You look at the death toll and all that kind of stuff, and I think to begin with, to say that Ebola and COVID-19 are anywhere similar to each other is wrong in itself. So then moving on to what the UNSC could actually do. Well, to begin with, I think it's very hard in this instance because the United States and China are such, they're always nearly at war with each other, are part of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, is that when one's accusing the other of unleashing this pandemic on the world, you're never going to be able to work together to come up with a solution, or if anything, to lead the world in the right direction when the person you're sitting opposite at is the person who you think started the entire thing. So I think that's problematic in itself. And then finally, we look at what the actual role is of the UNSC, and it's not to deliver a cure, and it's not to tell everyone what they should do in this instance. That's what the World Health Organization is there to do. And the World Health Organization is the one that is actually leading everyone and telling everyone, well, this is this and this is this. And then it comes down to each individual country to work together towards finding a cure and all that kind of stuff. So I think in the end, the UNSC will have a role when this starts to settle down and work to the steps that we can take in case future pandemics come out. But I think at the crux of it and at the peak is one country which is experiencing this very differently to another. Take Australia, for example. We've had less than 100 deaths. We can't go and tell Italy what to do because they're at 500 deaths a day. So I think when it comes to these big organisations and these international corporations, is for members to tell other members what to do at the time when no one really knows what to do and everyone's saying that this is working and this isn't, is very much country based. So for an organisation that isn't getting all the data coming in, it's going to be hard for them to tell everyone what to do and what a plan is. So in terms of the World Health Organization, they're getting that data, they get the statistic, countries report to them in terms of that health information, where it's not as processed in the UNSC.
One more question to all the panelists is, there's been 2 sets of organizations that have been coming up. That's the G4 and the coffee table group, which even Australia is part of actually. So the G4 possess that India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil get the permanent member seat, which is interesting because there's no African country in these four countries, as I mentioned. There are no African countries being mentioned. And the rest of the group, that's Canada, Australia, Pakistan, and all these countries mentioned that no, it should be like this, how the UNSC is, it should be maintained in that way. Recently, there's also been a report by the French government stating that, especially under François Hollande and Emmanuel Macron, that France is ready to give away their permanent member seat if all 5 of them give it away at the same time. So one of the important questions is, which is better, to have a permanent member seat and to just extend the mandate to few more countries, or to just do away with it? Whoever wants to go first.
I don't know who wants to intervene first.
You can Andrea, you can go first. Alecia just spoke, you can go first.
Okay. So let me double check. Your question was related to the United Nations Security Council, right?
Yeah. So basically my question is
our opinion if to extend the permanent seats or to keep it as it is. Well, as I said before.
No. My question was Andrea, sorry. My question was if to keep the permanent member seat, like to just expand it, or to do away with it, like no permanent members, or if there's permanent members, no veto powers.
Okay, great. As I said before, I also support the thesis of non-permanent categories. All the states should have the same rights. I think this permanent seat was justified after the Second World War, but not anymore. We are not living in the same context. And if we really want to achieve the UN principle of equal sovereignty of a state, of sovereign equality of all its members. So if we really want to create a more democratic organ, talking about Security Council, we don't need permanent categories. We need equal states with equal responsibility. So from my perspective, but I would like to listen others' view.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I will complete what Andrea has just said. In my point of view, I think the question is not if we have to keep or to extend. The question is to know if this composition, the existence of permanent members at the United Security Council, give some objective solution to the world problem to which we are facing. For me, this is the problem. So the opportunity to keep or to extend will depend on the objectivity on how the United Security Council in its present composition is dealing with current issues concerning the world. And so we can, if we decide to extend to some states, the same problem can resist, because it depends on how states decide in the circle. So for me, the question is not to keep or to extend. The question is which kind of politics must be adopted in the governance system of United Nations Council Security. For me, this is the real question. Thank you.
Oh, is it my go? Oh. Well, I think, contradictory to my colleagues, I think that it's important to have permanent seats in international bodies. Or if they're not permanent seats, there needs to be some kind of increased length in time that these non-permanent bodies would be sitting. I mean, what can you change in 2 years? And I think the reason that it is at 2 years that the turnover occurs is because over 2 years, it's enough to kind of get your point across. And then by then you get flicked. So I, contrary to everyone else, think that it is quite important that there are permanent people who sit there. And I think the only way I could justify the fact that there wouldn't be permanent members is if there was longer terms from the other states. But in increasing the terms of other states, you decrease the fact that you do have that changeover occurring so consistently, or frequently for that matter. That's all.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. If anybody wants to join, they can join this discussion. Marie, if you want to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for your great presentations. It was very interesting, especially for me, because I don't know a lot about the Security Council, and I want to know more. Anyway, this question that you just asked about whether we should keep these 5 members or extend the numbers of our permanent members or just go without them, made me think of another question. Andrea, you were talking about the principle of sovereign equality, which according to you is against this special situation of the 5 permanent members, because they have more rights, they have the veto. And so what is the justification of the United Nations when they've created this distinction between the permanent members and the non-permanent members? Why do they have this privilege over the other states? And is it this reason still valid nowadays? So yeah, whoever wants to answer.
Oh no, I'm not going first, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mary, yeah, are you hearing me? Yes, fine. Yeah, I think this principle in international law, in the UN Charter of sovereign equality of all its members, when you talk about the veto power, is incompatible completely. It's unfair. And it was created when they did the agreement after the Second World War. These categories was an agreement for the winners of the Second World War to have this veto power. But as I said in my presentation, maybe it was justified at the time to have these permanent categories, but it's not justified anymore if we want to create a more democratic organization. I believe, of course, I completely believe that this veto power and these permanent categories, these 5 high-level powers, are completely incompatible with the principle of sovereign equality of its members. If some countries want to fight and stand for more, how can we say it, to enforce the international law and to respect the principles, we need to suspend and we need to delete these categories. We can keep like 15 members, okay, because we are going to discuss issues related to maintain peace and security, act of aggressions, threat to the peace, okay, it's fine. But we cannot continue with these 5 permanent categories, but from my perspective. But as I said before, I can understand that was justified to give this veto power for the winners of the Second World War when they did the agreement to create the League of Nations. But we need a more democratic organization nowadays. So, well, that's my personal opinion.
If I could jump in.
Please, Faadhil.
Yeah, I'm coming from a similar position of ignorance as Marie, right? But from what I understood, or from the way I understand that the UN, the UN in general works, is that if you have, the General Assembly can take a vote by majority vote, right? And then the UN Security Council could veto that decision that's taken by the General Assembly. And is that in any circumstance? And then the second question that I wanted to ask is, like Alecia says, that you would need to have those permanent members of the Security Council in order for them to carry certain work or certain positions. And what I wanted to understand from this was that, does the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, do they undertake a greater administrative burden with regard to the UN? Is there a position that they try and follow or something like that? But why is it necessary that we have them there in that position? And then thirdly, sorry if I'm just thinking about it, is that if we did decide to extend the UN Security Council, right, or to have other members, what you have is a situation that results here is that where you have these 5 members that were the victors in the Allied powers that were the victors in World War II, you have an imbalance, like Andrea has been talking about all the time about sovereign equality, right? And if we decided to extend the UN Security Council to other people, to other members, like on what basis would we decide who becomes members of that Security Council, of that new constituted Security Council? I mean, in order to prevent a situation where you have haves and have-nots, and in order to ensure that there is more sovereign equality in the world. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. Coming back to the question asked by Marie. So I think the logic of the institution of permanent members is sometimes different by the application of the principle of equality between the members of the United Nations. The key justification of the institution of permanent members is can be found in the fact that these members are the founders members of the system. So they were I can say the purpose of the institutional system of the United Nations, and they don't want to. They want to keep it in its philosophy way, and this justifies the fact that these 5 members are keeping the 5 permanent seats. I take a situation which can explain more why it is important to keep the permanent members, but to change the system of functioning of these members. The situation of resolution 377, which is called Jean Adjison resolution in the history of United Nations peacekeeping operations. So when the United Nations Security Council is blocked by some veto rights, it is sometimes difficult to act the operation in the conflict context. And this way can justify that some controversial problem can occur and block the system if there is no a permanent member. And so, in my point of view, I think the key issue is not the presence of the permanent members, but the key issue is at which extent these members are acting on behalf of the international community interest, at which extent these members can act and represent the plural and diverse community, international community interest. It is because sometimes the action of the United Nations Security Council are violating some countries' interests, or are violating some basic principle of the system that many countries are talking about the discrimination in this circle. So for me, the question is not again to say we have to let the permanent seats, or we have to extend, but which kind of transparency system can we install between these permanent members at the United Nations Security Council? How can they work to translate the view of the international community? For me, it is at this way we have to focus and to find some solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Germain. Anybody can now step in. So one basic question I also had regarding if the Uniting for Peace resolution, which is resolution 377, has come upon, is a project that I am working on, or on a research paper I am working on, is extra charter rights. Basically, if there is a person A who goes in a country X, and then after that, if he's stuck up into a situation or something, does the responsibility of the state, that is the R2P, apply to his home state, and can they invoke this responsibility to go into that own state and actually retract them? For example, the best example can be NTP, wherein PLO forces had captured a particular plane. They got them to NTP, which is in Uganda, and the Israeli government then decided that let's do a covert operation, wherein they sent IDF forces down to NTP, retracted all civilians, all Israeli civilians, and got them back. There's no legal way to do that. So basically, it's again the factor of use of force and death and everything else that's coming. So anybody who wants to take up this question. Alecia, Murray. I know Murray is working on use of force right now.
So, sorry, let me just go back. So person A is a civilian.
Okay, so I told you the whole scenario wherein Israel, so there were Jewish citizens, Israeli citizens who were taken as hostage in a particular plane in a country, which was a third country altogether. And so basically the Israeli forces decided that going to the UN, going to the UNSC makes no sense. So let's use our own military. Let's go down there and let's retract them and come back.
Okay.
So basically, is that illegal? Sorry, is that legal? Or if it's legal, then are they doing it under the mandate of R2P? That's the responsibility to protect of a state.
Yeah. So there's two main issues that I see with this. So the first one is I'm going to call it Citizen 1. So Citizen 1 is unlawfully captured by country Z and taken to that home country where they're being, say, held captive against their will, ransom, all you want, all that kind of stuff. So there becomes a couple of issues which come up with this. Number one is that they've been taken unlawfully from their home country. Now, this differs if those citizens hadn't have been taken from their home country, so from Israel. If they were taken from country X, for example, then it becomes a little bit harder for the Israeli government to step in. And that's because in that kind of situation, you need to start looking at citizenship, rights, what country X was actually doing, and then looking at also what that country has to do with country Z, because this could have been a total coincidence that those people were naturally picked up. So in the instance where the Israeli citizens are taken unlawfully by country Z, then of course the military can step in and go into that country and take those people back. I could use the same example of the US government going to a country where there's, for example, a massive terrorist, and for the sake of the world, killing that person, although it's unlawful just to go into a country and shoot someone. The issue that the globe sees is the sake of killing one person unlawfully more beneficial for the globe as a whole. And of course, 75% of the world would say, well, killing that person was more beneficial. So in the eyes of the Israeli government, of course, if there's, say, 50 citizens that have been taken by country Z, there is a legal right that they can go in and they can remove those people. And of course, they need to try not to use force, try not to kill anyone, all those kind of things. But there's nothing stopping them from doing that. Looking at what the two countries have in terms of their treaties and their rights between each other, would also benefit from seeing what kind of end relationship they're going to have. But in terms of from the start, there's nothing stopping the government going into another country and trying to remove its citizens.
Andrea or Faadhil, anybody? Also, thanks, Alecia, for your insights.
Okay, that's all right.
Andrea, you're unmuted.
I would like to double check the scenario that you say, Siddhartha.
Yeah.
Something about Israeli forces and the responsibility to protect. I have some comments, but if you just can.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll just clarify. So basically, in the 1975 or 79, to be precise, actually, there was a plane that was going all the way from Athens to Paris, Paris to Tel Aviv. Between Athens to Paris, there were PLO forces along with the Rote Arme. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, who captured the plane because they knew there were Israeli citizens on them. Israeli means Jewish citizens. What they did was they took the plane, they captured the plane, they took them to another country, that was Uganda. At that time, you have to remember, Uganda was under a dictatorship of Idi Amin. It was a dictatorship country. So under the auspices of Idi Amin, the PLO forces took the Jewish refugees and they kept them. And they also dismissed all the other refugees. They were only looking for Israeli citizens. What happened later on was after a few weeks, the Israeli government themselves decided nobody's going to help us. So we shall take upon the burden on ourselves and go and rescue our own citizens. And that's what I'm asking is, at that time, in these kind of cases, the responsibility to protect, which is invoked by many states who intervene into nations, permissible or not permissible?
This is a case like hours of crisis.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, well, you were talking about the responsibility to protect. Well, from my perspective, this term or this concept, the responsibility to protect, is a creation of the Western countries to intervene in internal affairs of other countries. They use their responsibility to protect violations of human rights, to do military interventions in another countries, to go and look for natural resources in Africa, in some countries even like Venezuela. So I don't support this concept of the responsibility to protect. I prefer to say if you have an internal affair, we have to let this state solve their problem without intervention of other states. And I think this case could be interesting to do an analysis from the responsibility of the state for the commission of internationally wrongful acts. But of course, we need more time to do a proper analysis, but it's very interesting, these elements in the theory of the responsibility of the states for internationally wrongful acts as illegal acts.
Thank you so much.
Germain, if you want to say something else.
Can I intervene in between? I'm Dr. Saurabh Mishra.
Sure, so so if you want to ask a question, you can, sir. Or I think you've just paused, muted. Germain?
This is Dr. Saurabh.
Yes,
I
sir.
want to intervene with regard to the responsibility to protect. The document about responsibility to protect and the resolution of the UNSC is very clear about it. And this can be used only in 4 cases. This is like ethnic cleansing, war crimes, genocide, and crime against humanity. Very clear about it. If conditions are met, you can go for it, given UNSC passes a resolution for it again and gives a mandate to the forces and certain countries who have brought the proposal. Just that. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Actually, sir, we were not talking about the R2P principle by the UNSC, the draft articles. We were more talking on the grounds which was prepared in the Trava affairs, which was there on protection of the citizens.
Okay.
We were on
I thought you were asking about the conditions in which it could be applied. Certain condition you were talking about.
Yeah, that's there, sir, but we were more on the Trava affairs and everything. No problem, sir.
So thank you.
No problem. Germain?
Okay. I I can say that I don't I don't understand very well the case, but I will try to give some elements of answer. And I think in your case there is at least three parameters.
Okay.
First one can be a hypothesis of commission of a wrongful act by a state. The second can be the question of intervention in another state by another state. And the second can be the principle of the protection of the territorial integrity by the host state in which another state is intervening. And so I'm not sure that in this context, as explained, we can use the pretext of the R2P. I think the concept R2P is not appropriate in this context. What I can say is that where the forces are, so you take the example of Uganda, I think for another country so national one to come and to enter in Uganda and to rescue his forces, the consent of Uganda country is very necessary, even though the original act is a wrongful act, because there is the principle in international law which is said use non-oriental. So another state cannot pretext by the violation of international law and violate also an international to have some rights in the situation. And so this is some explanation, but I'm not sure to understand very well your case. Yes.
I was wondering something about this case. Can everybody hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is basically a hijacking, and I was thinking about the rules applying to piracy at sea, and I was wondering maybe if there are similar rules applying to piracy in the air, because they also call it piracy, and it is possible. It's been legal. It's been held legal by the Security Council that any state, even a third state, can intervene on a country, on a territory, if they are holding people that have been taken by force from a ship. So maybe there is a regulation. I have no idea. Actually, I think it's an interesting case, and I'd like to do some research about that. But maybe there are some rules applying to people who've been hijacked in the air and who are taken away in another territory, so that the first state is allowed to enter by force this territory to get the citizens back.
Yeah, I think we're all done. Thank you so much for any insights. Any other questions anybody has can just unmute themselves and they can just come into the discussion.
I have a question, even though I am a technical. My question is my question goes to Alecia. Alecia, do you hear me?
Alecia, are you there? Yeah, she's there. Dude.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, I want her to give us the one or the official position of the United States at the United Nations Security Council, because in fact today we can tempt you we can be tempted to say United Nations, United States of America are making today international law, And the Trump area is very illustrative. His impact on the functioning of the international institutions are very illustrative also. So Alecia, can you give us the position of the United States of America at the United Nations Security Council?
Look, I can have a go. I have to say that in my role, I don't really have a lot to do with the Security Council as it is. I think it's really important to understand the fact that Donald Trump is one of those people who is almost like he's an artist. He's absolutely a theatrical, almost comedian kind of person. And that's why he is so successful. And he's successful in the United States because people can really engage with him in terms of his theatrics. Everything for him is a performance. I've been fortunate enough that I've been to several of his rallies. He's come and given speeches with troops that I've worked with and stuff like that. And it is for him a performance. So I think that when the globe as a whole is watching him and they're watching him speak and they're listening to what he's saying, is the fact that I know there's been millions of times where we've given him documents in terms of the US military position and what we need to do and where we stand and what the actual legal position is. And he literally just takes it and he's like, oh yeah, okay. He'll read over it and he'll take bits of it without taking the whole thing. And then he just makes up everything else because he's a performer and it doesn't fit in the performance. So I think in terms of what you see from the United States, it's very different to what, as a whole, the US actually, what their standpoint is and where they sit. So I know, for example, in US military, and especially all the people I work with, it's a very different feel and a very different vibe than I think what the rest of the world sees. I think a lot of the time people see the United States and especially their military as kind of this, if you're not going into some kind of great career, you'll go into the military because you're all for country pride and all that kind of stuff. So for me especially, that was very much what I thought I was getting into when I went from Australia to the States and joined and started dealing with the law and helping these people. But in fact, a lot of the time, these people have actually just joined because it's an easy job for them. They have great job security. I mean, COVID-19 at the moment, and I haven't lost a single member of my team. And they have these ridiculous benefits when they finish. I mean, you serve 10 years and then the government will pay you 60 grand a year. Where else in the world can you get that kind of thing? So I think that, I appreciate the question, but I think the US as a whole is really, really divided. That they put on this brave front and they've got this character who plays the role of we're the United States and we're the top of the world almost. But when it actually comes down to it, he's playing it up for the sake of everything that can be played up. We look back at some of the initial questions about COVID-19, and the United States is a perfect example of a divided country. You look at what Donald Trump says is we need to open because we want to save the economy and we want to save the US. And meanwhile, one state up from him in New York is literally dying. And he's like, but we should open the country. So I think our position globally is to have this forefront where we portray the fact that we're the bee's knees and we're the boss and we've got everything sorted in our life. But in reality, it's very much the opposite, that you have all of these little ants working together to get somewhere, and most of the time they actually never get to the Queen. The message never actually gets through because the Queen's got an agenda for their own.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think everybody has to leave also right now. So yeah. So, no issues. Actually, I did have some questions. So thank you so much for having us, and I'd like to I'm really, really grateful for Alecia, Andrea, and Germain to actually spare some time. We also exceeded like 40 minutes of our time. So thank you so much, guys, for having, and thank you so much for having these insights. I've recorded the whole meeting, so I soon shall be sharing it with all of you. And I hope to be in touch with all of you. Thank you so much.